Robert Keiter is the Wallace Stegner Professor of Law at this university, Distinguished Professor of Law, and Director of this center, as all of you, I'm sure, already well know. And I think the only thing I would add to the prospect that we will really learn something about management is that he has also been persistent in pursuing that topic.
Thank you very much. I'm good at managing everything but time, but I will try to take account of that now. I told my colleagues in the past when they organized these symposiums that they would have to speak, and now I'm paying the price for that. Actually, I'm going to deviate from one of the rules here because I think this coincidence is just extraordinary, totally unplanned on our part. But Tony, who was just up here, mentioned that he wanted to end with Wallace Stegner's words. What he didn't tell you is that he is currently the PhD mentor for Wallace Stegner's granddaughter at the University of California. And Wallace Stegner's daughter-in-law tells me that to belong to the Barnosky lab is a little like making the Olympic team, except that the coach is still winning his own golds and many times over. So we're just thrilled that he's been able to be with us today. Let me see if I can, first of all, figure out how things work and jump into this. I think perhaps we actually organized the symposium well and that the topics flow a bit. I should tell you that I'm the lawyer up here, the first one I believe, and I'm all text and no photograph, a little bit like the urban cowboy who's all hat and no cow. But I wanted to start with the Path of the Pronghorn slide that Jody alluded to earlier in order to just make the key initial point, which is that in this case where we're talking about conservation efforts on behalf of the antelope that spend their summers in, let's see, how do I get the light on here? That's not it. No, sorry. I should have gotten lessons before. Who spend their summers in both the national park, Grand Teton National Park, and some of it on the National Elk Refuge, which is found up here. And then spend their winters down here south of Pinedale, Wyoming. In the course of their lifespan, you'll see that they are on parkland, National Wildlife Refuge land, National Forest land, crossing as they move, and I should say this is the longest continuous migration currently going on in the continental United States. They travel round trip something over 300 miles, at least some of them. And also that this migration has been going on, as I understand it, for something in the neighborhood of 6,000 years. As they move through the national forest, they then come out on some combination of privately owned land, largely ranch land, but not exclusively subject to subdivision. State school trust lands, these little blue dots or the blue rash that you see in here, and eventually as they continue to move through this upper Green River Valley, cross an major highway that connects Pinedale, Wyoming down to Jackson, and then move on down into Bureau of Land Management lands, the yellow lands here, where, as many of you know, there's very extensive oil and gas development going on currently. At some of these what they call choke points or bottlenecks, the corridor narrows down up here around Trappers Point to not much more than 150 yards in width. And so it's a real challenge to move across this fragmented landscape. That raises then the issues that I've tried to highlight here. How do we conserve habitat when existing political boundaries and management priorities aren't entirely consistent? Fragmented landscape, the instability of nature, et cetera, those pose the issues. Our goals, I think, are to improve coordination among both the land management agencies, the property owners, promote some sort of landscape scale management approach, identify and protect, if possible, connections. We've talked about why that's important. Potentially secure new protective designations. How do we go about promoting private land conservation? And what role does adaptive management play in this process? Taking a look at the multiple jurisdictions and the different landscapes, we'll see, as many of you are aware, that there are very different management approaches and laws and policies that govern the different principal land regimes. And I start with the federal system, and I'll work on down at the national park level. Fundamentally a conservation regime. Interestingly enough, this is legislation that dates back to 1916. Park Service has no explicit legal biodiversity mandate, but it certainly has integrated biodiversity conservation into its management policies. No hunting in the national parks. Recent management policies provide for viewing parks as part of larger landscapes and engaging in collaborative conservation approaches. Basic management strategy, one of non-intervention. Basically try to leave nature alone. As we move down the scale here of different federal land systems, national wildlife refuges, you see the basic laws governing those, fundamentally conservation. Because this is relatively new legislation, the 98 National Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act, interestingly enough, we now see some of this more progressive language showing up in the statute of ensuring biological integrity, diversity, and environmental health, and looking not only to the present but looking toward the future, which, interestingly enough, Congress had the sense to do back in 1916 with the Park Service legislation, too. Recreational use encouraged, hunting generally allowed on the refuges. The legislation calls for comprehensive conservation plans, and basic policies that have been adopted under this recognize that this includes consultation and coordination outside of the boundaries with adjacent owners, state game and fish agencies, and ultimately a basic policy goal of trying to ensure ecological integrity at multiple landscape scales. Again, tracing the pronghorn path, we run into the National Forest System, basic multiple use, sustained yield mandate governing that, which includes among different types of uses, wildlife and fish conservation or use. In 1976, the Congress further modified or added to the Forest Service's legal mandates by including, interestingly enough, a diversity mandate in the National Forest Management Act that was translated initially by regulation into a requirement of maintaining minimum viable populations. That has evolved over a couple of different iterations of proposed and sought to be implemented and joined by courts regulations that now in the proposed regulations the goal seems to be to maintain viable populations, and minimum term drops out here. The National Forest Management Act includes a coordination provision, and interestingly enough, that's beginning to show up pretty commonly in these types of land management statutes. But interestingly enough, the proposed regulations that were just released less than a month ago actually seek to put at least modest teeth in that by requiring the agency in its planning process to go through and review the plans of adjacent land management agencies and governmental entities, to display them and to at least address them in the plan, rather than just simply saying, as had been the practice or seems to have been the practice, well, we coordinated with our neighbors. The new regs talk in terms of larger scale planning, coordination. Here we bump into notions of concurrent jurisdiction between the federal land manager and the state agencies over wildlife, and that particularly plays out in the hunting arena with some closure authority that has rarely, if ever, I think we'll hear more about that later, been invoked. That is closure authority on the part of the federal land managing agencies. The Bureau of Land Management, another major federal landowner in the western United States, has a similar multiple use sustained yield mandate, a different or slightly more expansive array of types of uses that are permitted and managed for on BLM lands, but fundamentally these lands have been used heavily for industrial type of activity, commodity production, utilization. But nonetheless, there are provisions for wildlife, watershed, and actually scenic and scientific values noted. Provision for interdisciplinary planning, another coordination provision, supplemented by a requirement of consistency, or a provision for consistency with state and local plans that does not necessarily mean that the BLM has to entirely be consistent there. Provision for designation of something known as ACECs, areas of critical environmental concern. No biodiversity provision at all in sight within the FLPMA legislation or the implementing regulations. And again, concurrent jurisdiction with the state wildlife management agencies over wildlife management. Overlaid on this array of these four principal federal land systems are a variety of what have evolved as protective types of designations, ranging from the Wilderness Act of 1964, the famous or infamous, depending on where you're from in the West, National Forest Roadless Area Rule that protects non-wilderness lands that have not yet been developed. Its fate still hangs in the balance, but nonetheless an effort to extend some additional protection. The BLM, now legitimized by Congress, is maintaining a national landscape conservation system that is composed of their wilderness lands, conservation areas, and a variety of other protective types of designations, study areas, the wildlands policy that you've heard about that Secretary Salazar referenced recently. The National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act provides an overlay of protection. All of this leading to sort of an expansion of the reserve concept that we've heard is so important to protection of wildlife habitat earlier. The Endangered Species Act, we've heard quite a bit about that. It is a cross-cutting overlay law that indeed does provide a level of protection both to listed species and their habitat, and unlike these earlier designations, reaches onto private lands in addition to public lands. And I can't leave out the National Environmental Policy Act, although as we've heard last night from Zig Potter, it is a process statute. Nonetheless, it at least forces the agencies, when they're contemplating doing something, to stop, analyze the environmental consequences before moving forward, and provides an opportunity for public involvement to weigh in on whatever is proposed. We see, as I noted in the with the pronghorn, that we have state trust lands that we find throughout the West. They're managed radically differently from the earlier lands that I referred to. These are under state ownership. They were granted to the states by Congress at the time of statehood, principally to support public education. And the primary management goal is one of financial return for the beneficiaries, with little or no conservation, explicit conservation obligation on the part of the state trust land managers. There are some issues about potential access to these lands for hunting and other recreational uses. Private lands, we've heard about that before. They make up a significant part of the landscape, especially in some of the most sensitive areas, particularly here in the west, along the water courses, the rivers, etc. In fact, nationally, we find that about 90% of the listed species have some of their habitat needs on non-federal or primarily privately owned lands. These lands are not governed by federal law, unlike the earlier ones I talked about. State law controls, and it's state land use planning and zoning laws that attach, if indeed there are any meaningful zoning or planning requirements, which, as most of you know, here in the West is not something that's all that popular. But nonetheless, that provides the basic legal framework for oversight of private lands. Attached to private ownership of lands are ownership rights protected constitutionally under the Fifth Amendment, and the principles that at least historically have prevailed are that it's the landowner's right to decide what he or she might do with their land, and that land, for the most part, is viewed as a fungible commodity. It doesn't matter if it has particular ecological values or not. Some of these ideas are at least in flux, as notions such as Aldo Leopold's land ethic suggest that there are responsibilities that attach to private land ownership. It's not just all have at it yourself as you see fit for your individual pleasure. The Native Americans have significant land holdings throughout the West and elsewhere in the country. Tribal Self-Governance Act gives the Native Americans significant amount of authority and control and management over natural resources if they so choose on their own lands, which provides an additional major player with respect to management generally and wildlife management and conservation in particular. There are a variety of federal laws that provide a degree of protection to Native American lands that extend not only to those lands but outside of the lands. I've listed a couple there. Treaty rights often are significant in understanding the relationship between tribes and nearby federal lands, and various treaty rights, many relating to or potentially affecting wildlife, have been preserved and protected by the courts. When dealing with the tribes, the federal agencies are instructed to deal with them as sovereign nations and engage in government-to-government negotiation. The opportunities are there to engage in some type of coordinated planning between adjacent landowners and owners and managers and the tribes. And in fact, we see some collaboration occurring in various locations. One that got a great deal of press a number of years ago was when the state of Idaho refused any role in managing the wolves that were reintroduced there, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service arranged with the Nez Perce tribe to oversee on-the-ground management of the wolves in Idaho. Another major player, not necessarily a major landowner, state wildlife managers, principally state game and fish agencies, overseen by commissions that are usually politically appointed entities, whereas the game agencies themselves tend to be professional wildlife managers. The focus is on wildlife management, primarily historically on management of big games for purposes of recreation, and that recreation is primarily hunting. We do see the federal government getting involved through federal grant programs through the exercise of Congress's spending power to provide wildlife grants to the states upon completion of action plans. I think we'll hear more about that later today. One of the focal points of this program is away from simply focusing on big game populations, but trying to integrate a degree of biodiversity conservation into state wildlife management. And you see through the non-game species programs that also occurring on the ground with the state agencies. We've seen states engaged in reintroductions as well as the federal government. These are some of the examples over recent years. The Western Governors Association, which of course the governors would oversee state game agencies, have been active in this area. More about the wildlife corridor concept later. Other players, this was mentioned earlier, there's a tremendous array of moving beyond the actual landowners into other entities that are interested and involved in wildlife conservation. All of them usually end up with a place at the table as we try to figure out how to move forward and to knit the landscape together, and I've tried to provide you with at least a sort of short list here of some of those groups that are interested. So that's the if you will, sort of the political fragmentation that we see, and there's actual fragmentation on the landscape. And we've seen some pictures of this earlier. Industrial activities up in the area involving the pronghorn, significant oil and gas activity. Timber harvesting out in the Pacific Northwest occasioned the decline of the spotted owl population out there that led to a major battle that most of you are familiar with. Livestock grazing impacts the landscape and conservation values significantly in many areas. Add on to that roads, energy transmission corridors, off-road activity, and then carry on into private land development, subdivision, urban wildland interface. All of this on the ground contributes to the sort of fragmentation problems that our earlier speakers spoke about. One thing I think that's worth noting in terms of fragmentation, in addition to these different types of activities, you often find different communities located nearby who have quite different values, economic goals, and interests. Here in Utah, compare Moab and Monticello. Up in the Yellowstone area, compare Jackson, Pinedale, and Big Piney. And you see some significant differences in terms of how those folks view the world around them. Add on top of that, as we have also talked about, the dynamic nature of ecosystems, the unpredictability of stochastic events, like among other things, the earthquake that occurred in Japan overnight. Fires and floods are more common in this part of the world. Climate change and its potential implications, including ecological and biological change that Tony talked about earlier. But that's the natural side of things. On the human side of things, they don't stay the same either. Our political regimes change, and sometimes radically, as we're all aware of that in this room, as we flip from, for example, BLM focused in the Babbitt-Clinton years on creation of a national landscape conservation system to one during the Bush-Norton years to one focused on energy development. Our public values evolve, perhaps not as quickly as elections, and economic change. And we're all familiar with the evolution that has occurred and continues to occur in the West in terms of basic sort of economic priorities within many of our communities. So has anything happened yet? Yes, we've made some steps to try to address this question of fragmentation, uncertainty, etc. During the Clinton administration, we saw the concept of ecosystem management rise to the fore, supplemented by notions of collaborative conservation. A number of different initiatives were undertaken. I note the Pacific Northwest Forest Plan. You can add to that the Sierra Nevada Forest Plan amendment process, the development of cooperative ecosystem study units, linking federal agencies with universities to understand what was happening and what changes were occurring on the ground, and a variety of other related initiatives. During the Bush administration that followed the Clinton folks, cooperative conservation was the watchword. A number of different initiatives highlighted in the principal report that the administration did on that, including, among other things, makeover of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. Fairly heavy emphasis in the cooperative conservation arena by the Bush administration on hunting and fishing types of utilization and conservation goals for wildlife, along with noting a number of Endangered Species Act success stories, or at least seeming success stories. The Obama administration, we're still waiting to see precisely where they're headed. Recent release of the America's Great Outdoors report suggests that there is a broad recognition of the concept of the need for landscape level management with connectivity, and as noted earlier, the creation of the, all of a sudden I'm going blank, LCCs, Landscape Conservation Cooperatives. Institutionally, we have some history here. Back in the 60s, the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee was created to try to facilitate some better coordinated management among the principal federal land managers in the area. Its track record is at best mixed, but nonetheless, you at least see a recognition and an effort to move forward on that score. More recently, the Crown of the Continent Managers Group is getting a great deal of attention up in the Glacier, Waterton, Bob Marshall complex area to try to approach both understanding scientifically, economically, socially the area, and perhaps down the road to engage in some meaningful collaborative management. Western Governors Association, interestingly enough, a few years ago endorsed pretty strongly the notion of creating wildlife corridors to ensure and protect native wildlife, particularly in the face of rapid energy development. The Wyoming governor was one of the principal proponents of that, seeing the energy activity occurring in the Pinedale area and its potential impact. Enhanced role for science and public involvement. Both of these facts, I think, have been evolving over time. Public involvement, ever since NEPA was adopted, really has, the door has been open for us, if you will, to have a say in decision making, at least at the federal level where the federal agencies are involved, and many of these activities involve federal agencies in one way or another. It doesn't necessarily mean they'll follow what we might suggest or prefer, but nonetheless the opportunity to be involved. And I probably should include in here the opportunities for judicial review of agency decisions. As for science, there's a consistent bowing to science, but we also see legislation incorporating science more and more into management regimes. The Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act has a very strong scientific component. A year earlier, the National Park Service was given an explicit scientific management with reform legislation there. So how should we and can we go about knitting this landscape together? Well, these are broad concepts given the time constraints, but the notion of ecosystem or landscape scale planning for conservation it seems to me, is the time is now. And there continues to be gradual recognition of this in the planning processes for at least the various federal land management agencies. How do we promote, more coordination? I outlined briefly before what the Forest Service's proposed rules require. It seems to me that requiring something whenever these plans or decisions are made, like a coordination statement by the proposing agency that would specifically require a response to concerns of neighboring land managing agencies would be a step in the right direction. We certainly could go further in the law, but at least as a first step, this makes some sense. The connective corridor idea has, as I said, taken hold within the Western Governors Association. I'll come back to the Pronghorn Initiative. Underlying what has been accomplished to date is the question of whether this is a concept that might merit being incorporated into legislation. We also are seeing to try to make the landscape whole, species reintroductions and translocations in some instances. And that helps to contribute to maintaining and promoting conservation values going forward. The most famous species reintroduction, of course, is the wolf. How do we get people together? Again, these are broad terms that I've used here. Collaborative conservation planning, getting everybody at the table engaged and having a meaningful role through such things as partnerships, consultation arrangements, and just opening the door for public involvement. A lot of this stuff, some of it's happening from the top down by virtue of the laws that require this sort of planning and decision-making processes, but a fair amount of it also is coming from the bottom up. And that is through citizen groups and others that are coming together and making their presence known and, in essence, forcing their presence and views on land managers. Some of it also is occurring, as I suggest here, in the shadow of the law. The Endangered Species Act has proven to be a very powerful tool for bringing parties to the table, not just the federal agencies, state agencies, but also private landowners concerned about addressing potential Endangered Species Act problems, hopefully sooner rather than later. NEPA provides a vehicle, and it is being used more and more as time goes by for cooperating agency status by adjacent land managing agencies, which changes, at least to some modest degree, the dynamic in decision making going forward. Speaking about working from bottom up, a variety of those types of initiatives showed up in the recent omnibus public land legislation that Congress adopted and the President signed. In 2009, we're familiar here with the Washington County bill, the Oahe bill in Idaho, and there were a dozen or so other compromises that included a conglomeration of wilderness, some wildlife language and protection, and often some sort of economic provisions acknowledging concerns of local communities. That sort of compromise, sort of bottom-up negotiated initiative seems to be one of the ways forward to promote broader conservation. And they're reflected in these citizen initiatives, the Malpai Borderlands Initiative that dates back about 20 years, Blackfoot Challenge up in Montana, where you see groups of citizens, ranchers, and other concerned citizens coming together in order to try to avoid excessive subdivision, protect habitat and way of life. More formally, the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency was cemented into legislation some 20, 30, 40 years ago, and it provides another potential, more formal model for moving forward. Do we need new designations, whether they are new or new in fact or new on the ground? As we've heard, it doesn't hurt to expand the scope of protected areas. There are a variety of proposals floating around for either new parks, expansions of existing parks. I can't let the opportunity pass, not to mention that a proposal has been around for some 20 years now to expand the boundaries of Canyonlands is one of those many proposals. Ideas about supplementing boundaries, for example, of national parks with designated national preserves, a concept that originated largely in Alaska and provides a little more flexibility for management, is another potential vehicle for expansion of reserve-type protection. New monuments, refuges, wilderness areas, the sort of standard litany of protected designations that you're all familiar with. I have raised the question in a couple of different contexts whether, and it seems to me this fits with some of our earlier presentations, whether we ought to think at the federal level of something like a new national restoration area designation. We don't have that in place formally, but in fact, de facto and informally, we do very much have that concept in place. If you take a look at the history of all, or of the major eastern national parks, they all came from heavily used farmlands, timberlands, etc., and were in bad shape when the Park Service acquired them. I'm thinking of Great Smokies, Shenandoah in particular, and over the course of 50 years or so, they basically restored themselves. Add on top of that the legislation passed in 1911, known as the Weeks Act, which opened the door for purchase by the Forest Service of the cut-over timberlands in the East and the Midwest, and that's where our Eastern and Midwestern national forests come from. Why not something like that type of approach here in the western part of the country, to take some of the landscapes that have been hit pretty hard, are no longer significantly productive, and put some sort of a designation on them with the notion that over time, not immediately, but over time, they will become and can become important for conservation purposes. I already alluded to the notion of wildlife corridor legislation. This could be modeled, for example, on the National Trails Act that has been so successful in knitting together trails ranging from, most of this was in place to begin with, the Appalachian Trail to the Pacific Crest Trail that runs the length of the mountain, of the north to south across the United States. The challenge on private lands, tools are somewhat different. Partnerships I've alluded to, land exchanges have been used, are available. They've been particularly effective with state school trust lands. Conservation easements, significant acreage is now in conservation easements. The government is not a major player in this. The NGO organizations, ranging from the Nature Conservancy, Trust for Public Lands, etc., are. It is a vehicle that, or a tool that uses incentives rather than the regulatory stick. Land and Water Conservation Fund, if it ever gets fully funded, is available for actual outright purchase of sensitive private lands that have conservation value. Tax incentives built into the conservation easement program could be expanded. We see wildlife damage compensation provisions showing up, part of the wolf reintroduction regulations, as I recall. Private hunting permits have been used to generate revenue and to make conservation attractive for private landowners, incentive payments for making the lands available for breeding and use of particular species. The Conservation Reserve Program by the DOA, just one of multiple types of federal programs. I'm certainly not familiar with all of them. And then the bottom line, if incentives don't seem to work and there's a need to take action, there is the regulatory stick, and the Endangered Species Act, of course, has some of that. It has been softened through these programs, the habitat conservation plans, safe harbor program, et cetera, et cetera. But there is, in fact, broader federal regulatory authority on behalf of the federal land management agencies if they were inclined to exercise that authority. We still face uncertainty and instability. Adaptive management has been suggested as the way forward, and the basic structure of adaptive management is outlined there. There are issues here. There's a good deal of uncertainty as you move forward and adjust your management practices. Somehow concerns from the private or business sector for potential investment opportunities has to be taken into account. Science will help us figure out where conservation actions might be appropriate, but we need to get values in alignment and to improve and coordinate monitoring across the board. State trust lands, not a whole lot new to say here. Exchanges blocking up would make sense, and we've seen a significant amount of that happening here in the state of Utah over the last 10, 15 years. That has improved conservation values on the public lands in particular. We also see across the West conservation organizations stepping in and seeking to lease and generally being successful when challenged in the courts. Lands that previously were used for grazing, but paying the same amount and utilizing the lands for conservation purposes or buying development rights. The concept of mitigation banking that managers of public school trust lands might sell conservation values as mitigation for Endangered Species Act or Clean Water Act, where credits are needed is something that is beginning to occur. Revisions in the law ought conservation to be written into the basic mandate. Easy to say, very difficult to do in practice. As for funding, I think we'll hear much more about that later today, and I think I'll pass through this very quickly. I did want to note that the state of Wyoming, when flush with oil and gas revenues, created a state wildlife trust fund that has been used for purchase of sensitive habitat and has a good bit of cash in it, and is something that other states might think about as a vehicle for protecting habitat. The Colorado Lottery, as some of you may know, kicks off a good deal of the revenue that is kicked off is directed by law into conservation through the Conservation Fund and GOCO, or Great Outdoors Colorado. The climate change bill that passed the House but not the Senate had significant mitigation funds in it that would have been available to address wildlife habitat and conservation concerns. Generally, we'll see what happens going forward, but it's certainly a concept that Congress has before it. So no silver bullet at this point, I don't think. Some ideas for potentially moving forward. What we have, a patchwork of federal, state, local laws and initiatives, efforts both top-down and bottom-up to try to promote more coordinated planning, general but slow movement away from traditional protection and conservation of the big game species toward a broader recognition of the need to protect biodiversity broadly, not just at the federal level, but filtering down to the state level. I've raised most of the other points. Let me return to end at the path of the pronghorn. So what actually happened on the ground here? It's basically, I think, a pretty good story at this point. And that is that the Bridger Teton National Forest amended as the various players brought the concern forth to the agencies. The Bridger Teton Forest amended its forest plan to provide protection along this wildlife corridor, it becoming the first federally recognized, at least administratively, wildlife corridor for it's about 35 miles, I think, through that the pronghorn travel through the Bridger Teton National Forest. As you move out of the forest, the private lands in this area and working on down toward Pinedale, a number of local land trusts and conservation groups have secured conservation easements that protect against one subdivision, and two have opened the door for removal of fences and some of the other obstacles that the pronghorn faced in this area. Three, the state of Wyoming has just allocated $12 million through the Wyoming Department of Transportation to build, I forget if it's 4 or 6 overpasses or underpasses across Highway 191, which runs between Pinedale and Jackson, and then moving down to the BLM. In its recent planning process, the BLM designated several ACECs, areas of critical environmental concern, where development, oil and gas development, will not occur. Hence, actually putting into place on the ground a corridor that enjoys some level of protection to move the pronghorn from the parks and the refuges on down to the Winter Range. And if we can replicate this either through this sort of patchwork approach or perhaps institutionalize it, we will have taken a significant step forward. Thank you.